Now we go to Zimbabwe amongst the Shona. In her article, How Local Divine Powers Were Suppressed, a case of Mwari of the Shona, Musa discusses biblical translation amongst the Shona in modern colonial contexts. Musa holds that the Shona of Zimbabwe had a well-established monotheist system of the divine under the name of Mwari, which means creator. According to Musa, the Shona understood Mwari to be genderless, a genderless spirit, neither male or female. The attributes of Mwari all have to do with Mwari's transcendence and creative activities. Thus, these attributes include Nyanda of the sky, Mutongagara, the first one to exist, Mumbi, the one who forms, Musikavanu, the creator of people. Also, Mwari does not discriminate and can speak through women and even through objects as well as through men. Nguyasango's documentation of the of the process of translating the biblical deity amongst the Shona indicates similar plots with the Zulu case. It was a long process of debates characterized by translators importing names from outside and by various missionary bodies taking different positions at different times, up until the 1960s, when they all finally agreed that Mwari is the proper name for the Shona. First, the term Mudzimu from the Karanga ethnic group was employed by the Lutheran and Dutch Reformed churches between 1899 and 1912. Mbuyasango points out that amongst the Shona, the term Mudzimu refers only to an ancestral spirit. Its early use among the Karanga seemed to have influenced the corresponding Sotho-Tswana Mudimu due to missionary misunderstanding, she says. Second, an attempt to correct the mistake in 1909 and 1927 began to introduce the term Wedenga, which means deity of the sky. Wedenga was sometimes used alone and other times with a supplement, Mudzimu, to refer to something like the ancestral spirit god of the sky. Third, amongst the Catholic missions, different orders took different positions. For example, the Jesuits preferred to use Yahweh, the transliteration of biblical Yahweh, while the Dominicans used Mwari from the start. Methodist and Anglican missions were among those who also used Mwari from the beginning. This fluid situation continued for some decades. Finally, in the 1960s, Mwari was accepted by the Bible translator as the supreme being among the Shona, and that's the correct word to translate the biblical deity. According to Mbuyasango, the adoption of Mwari in the translation of the biblical deity was in fact a major dispossession. First, she says, it robbed the Shona of their tradition by colonizing Mwari. Second, it introduced gender to Mwari, who was never given a human form or gender. I quote, she says, thus in the Shona Bibles, Mwari becomes the name that was used for the new revealed God to Moses. Mwari becomes the God of Abraham, of Isaac, of Job, the God of the of the Shona deity by the biblical deity. The translation resulted in the colonization of the Shona god. Mwari ceased to be the God of the Shona people and became the God of the Hebrews. Shona ways of relating to their deity were replaced by the new ways of relating to Mwari as Yahweh. The Mwari shines in the Bible became an abomination. The connection between Mwari and the ancestors invalid. The list of activities abhorrent to Mwari, according to Deuteronomy 8:9 up to 13, include most of the ways the Shona people communicated with their God. Close quote. With this kind of biblical translation, Mbuyasango insists that for the Shona to relate to this God, Mwari, who is now in the Bible, they had to abandon their Shona identity and become Western. Their own religious traditions suddenly were deemed incompatible with Mwari, close quote. Moreover, she continues, the Shona Bible translation, Mwari is given a human form. In the Shona religious tradition, however, Mwari was truly holy, set apart from creation. Mwari had no form or image. Mwari was truly a spirit without sexuality or gender. But in the Bible, Mwari was given a human form. In this article, Mbuya Sango, the author, manages to paint graphically the cultural bomb that was planted when Mwari became the biblical deity. The missionary took Shona, God, captive by simultaneously colonizing the Shona supreme deity and dismissing all that culturally goes with Mwari. Mbuya Sango's discussion highlights that translations are not just about functional, dynamic, or formal equivalences in the target languages. Rather, that a language itself is a culture. A language is a text or a canon that bears the culture of the people, and that even taking one word can be taking huge chunks of that culture. While the Bible translation has been concerning itself with preserving the integrity of the source text, namely the Bible, there has hardly been any translation that fails to do violence to both the original and the targeted texts. Now I move to the Tswana, whom we have already discussed in the first lecture. In her article, Translating the Divine, the case of Mudimu in the Tswana Bible, Incluidi Bikuswani discusses the case of the Tswana Bible translation. The translation adopted the word Mudimu, colonially spelled as Mulimu or Murimu, meaning the high one or the one who dwells on high, right from the start in Robert Moffat's Bible of 1840. It did not, however, honor the indigenous understanding of spiritual gender. According to Incluidibi, Mudimu of Setswana culture is always neuter. In the Setswana Bible translation, however, Mudimu adopts the male gender, such that, for example, the Lord's Prayer begins by saying, Rara waruna okolehodimum, Rara meaning father. Mudimu, who never adopted feminine or male gender, became established as a male god in the Setswana Bible. In his Missionary Labors and Sins, Robert Moffat's massive volume is very harsh with Botswana and their sense of spirituality and knowledge of divinity, demonstrating the consistent conflict during colonial times between acknowledging natives' knowledge of God and denying it at the same time. Moffat says, Satan is obviously the author of polytheism of other nations. He has employed his agency with fatal success in erasing every vestige of religious impression from the mind of Botswana, Hottentots, and Bushmen, leaving them without a single link to unite them to the skies. Thus, the missionary could not make an appeal to legends, to altars, to an unknown God, or to ideas kindred to those he wished to import. Close quote. This is something that he says in page 244. Moffat continues to say, the Botswana's foolish hearts are darkened, and verily, this is a darkness which may be felt. Such people, he says, are living in what Job calls the land of darkness and shadow of death, spiritually buried and without knowledge of life or light. In this midst of denying Botswana any knowledge of God, only in page 244, when we read down to page 260 to 61, Robert Moffat himself gives an elaborate definition of Botswana's understanding of God, which I asked myself, didn't he have an editor to present such contradictory ideas. I quote, he says, among Batswana, the name of God adopted by missionaries is Murimu. This is the missionary way, the way they said it for Mudimu. This has the advantage of the name used by the Kafes and the Hotentos being more definite at its derivation at once determines its meaning. Mu, he says, is a personal prefix, and Rimu is from Hudimu, which means above, from the same root as Lehodimu, which means heaven. And its plural is Mahorimu, that derived from Lehodimu. The genius of Setswana language warrants us to expect a correspondence between the name and a thing being designated. But in this instance, it is reversed. Murimu has been represented as malevolent neuter, silo, or a thing. Moffat continues to say, according to one rule forming the plural of personal nouns beginning with mu, Barimu would be the plural of Murimu, but the word is never used in this form, or did it convey to Batswana mind or persons such a meaning. Concerning the response of Batswana to missionaries' use of Mudimu, Moffat reports that the Batswana never, however, disputed the propriety of using the noun Murimu for the great object of worship, that is Christianity. They never applied the name to human beings, he says. And he continues to say, Mudimu is never called a man. While pronouns agree with the noun, those of Murimu those which govern Murimu cannot, without the greatest violence of the language, be applied to that heavenly one. In terms of metaphors used for Mudimu, Moffat states that Batswana associated Mudimu with non-anthropomorphic metaphors as ant bear. Moffat's description of Mudimu of Batswana is elaborate, indicating that Batswana had built a linguistic system that avoided characterizing God as God using human images and metaphors. The Tswana belief would even prefer talking of God in the neuter form as silo, or use such a metaphor as ant bear than to define God according to the human experience or gender. Although Moffat observed that Mudimu is never called a man, in his Setswana Bible translation, however, Mudimu of Batswana was given the male-based names such as father, king, shepherd. The Setswana Bible translation was the first one, therefore, to associate God with male gender. Obviously, such a translation was not informed by the target language or culture of Batswana. Consistent with the Setswana way of constructing gender in the spiritual space, the community of Badimu, that is the ancestors, which included both men and women, was never identified in a particular gender. It was always designated in plural. As I said earlier, Badimu were transformed into the evil power in biblical translation of the Setswana. It is the word they use to translate demons. The rightful place of Badimu as intermediaries was now in the Setswana translation, occupied, of course, by Jesus, the only Son of God. For Jesus to occupy this place in the Setswana Bible, the missionary colonial translators needed to banish Badimu by turning them from a positive power, sacred power, to one that is negative and evil. This was done and achieved in one stroke of a translator's pen. As with the Zulu and the Shona, the Setswana translation was not only colonially informed, but also patriarchally driven. The translation not only deprived Batswana by taking Mudimu over and putting Mudimu in the Bible, the Badimu became demonic. This was a double loss for women in their spiritual space. For Mudimu now was explicitly male. But Dimu, on the other hand, were explicitly evil. It needs to be acknowledged that as these cases of the Shona and Zwana show, the Bible translation in most sub-Saharan countries entail both colonization and particularization of sacred concepts and spaces. All these cases were from the colonial past, old, about a century ago. Be that as it may, Alo Mujola reports the case of the Iraq of Tanzania indicates that Bible translation, a very recent Bible translation of the 1977 and 1990, indicates that Bible translation has not at all desisted from having translation serve as the intensification of patriarchy in African communities and possibly in other places of the world. I turn now to the Iraq case, Iraqo of Tanzania, and I ask, whose interests are served? In a very interesting and recent translation case, the first edition of the New Testament was published only in 1977, discussed by Alo Mujola. The Iraqo of Tanzania have always regarded God as female, and they regarded evil and its forces as male. Then they were presented with a Bible translation that presented God as male, which they found highly unacceptable. As Mujola points out, for them, it is the devil who is male or masculine. It is he who has to be placated through sacrifice. God's name is believed amongst the Iraqo to be Lua. She is the provider, the protector, the merciful, the giver of life. Because in many cases, translators argued that the indigenous name of God is being avoided because it carries different theological connotation. Mujola points out that the Lua, that is the feminine god of the Iraqo, satisfies the Christian qualities and attributes for the supreme God, such as the creator of the universe, loving, empowering, sustaining the created order, providing for all, and concerned about fairness and justice, and requiring mercy and morality and order. Yet, Lua of the Iraqo was not male, but female. To sideline Lua and enforce a masculine god, the imported Mungu, who has been for almost a century already in a biblical translation that has given him male attributes. So they transported the word Mungu from the Swahili and used it in the Iraqi Bible translation. Mujola records that the Christian and the non-Christian Iraqi have been encircled by the presentation of God as male in their Bible translation, and they have openly asked for this rectification. In 1990 review of the Iraqo, Mujola writes, I quote, I recall a Bible reviewer seminar organized in Haydn, Mbulu, 1990, where some of the Iraqo Christians who were being trained to be reviewers of the ongoing Iraqo Old Testament translation strongly pleaded for a change in the official church usage from the God's name in Swahili to God's name that is from Mungu to their own name, Lua. One leading Christian lady teacher at Wama Bible School in Bulu argued that she found it so difficult to do evangelism using a name from the Swahili. One Lutheran priest we hear is said to have rebelled by maintaining or persisting to use Lua in his preaching and teaching. If the Iraqo could not be granted what they desired, then whose interests are served in such a case? Clearly, it is all because faithfulness is not to the receptor culture or community that is receiving the translation, but to the source text, the Bible. Thus, Mujola points out, the first objection is that Lua is believed to be feminine, whereas the Christian God is believed to be masculine. He is the father of our Lord Jesus Christ. He is depicted in masculine anthropomorphic imagery. Bible translation is the proclamation and entrenchment of patriarchy in cultures that had more flexible and even female-centered cultures. In our quest for intercultural biblical interpretation, translation theories will need to be revisited to include, in my view, faithfulness to both the source and the receptor text. What we needed in such translation sites as the Iraqi was the TIV type of community that insisted that the story will be told according to their values. I close. Over the past 23 years, most biblical translations and their revisions have been done by male translators. This scene has hardly changed. For example, in the African continent, the UBS has only 4 or 2 female Bible translation consultants among, well, it used to be several males, but now I hear it's going to be 2. And before it changed, they told me that they are very proud of their 4 female translation consultants, because apparently if they compare themselves with other places, they're doing very well. Which tells us that it is still largely male consultants. However, when it comes to the translators themselves, those who are on the ground, I asked how many female translators are there. The answer I had is, if we say 4%, that would be just so generous. Possibly around 1%. So, Bible translation is done primarily by men. It would be interesting to find out how many women participate in Bible translations in other continents, as well as to examine their training. Indeed, one of the first feminist biblical studies heroines, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, got started with the project of the Women's Bible, which was published in 1895. When she sought to break the male dominance in Bible content interpretation, use, and translation, Cady Stanton, who was an activist for women's empowerment, became convinced that the Bible was a male book that served male interest. She thus set up a team of women to produce what became known as the Women's Bible. Cady Stanton's project has been studied critically, and this strengths and weakness has been highlighted in the feminist biblical scholarship for the past 50 years. But her point stands when she associated exclusive male translations with the making of the Bible into a male book. That is, those who translate, interpret, comment upon it, do it from their particular standpoints and to serve a particular ideology. The challenge is to call for self-conscious practitioners who apply hermeneutics of suspicion to themselves. It is important that we ask ourselves, where do we stand as translators? Are we translated men and women? If so, are we resisting translated subjects, or those who embrace and celebrate their translated identity? And to what ends? If we are translators, are we translating as vagabonds of the colonizing structures of our world, or are we translating as vagabonds of patriarchal ideology, entrenching it even where it didn't, exist? We who are our translators and translator consultants, are they male or female, are they black or white? This counts. How do Bible translation theories themselves embody an ideology of colonizing and suppressing other cultures. And what kind of translation models and theories do we need to decolonize and depatriarchalize our translation practices? Thank you very much.